of technologies became also available to most of the archaeologists. Another point that is important is that probably a bit earlier, but at that time also some archaeologists started thinking in a different way. I mean, they started thinking not just by size, but also in terms of continuity, not just, let's say, sites as dots or sites as island of knowledge, surrounded by nothing, by emptiness, but the landscape as a continuum, as, I mean, a context where it was also possible to explore, let's say, physical relationship between features. Now, we also started a critical review, and we based mainly our approach on two main issues. So one of them was empty spaces. So we realized that, notwithstanding we achieved, I mean, I would say from the quantitative point of view, very good results. But however, we realized that empty spaces still were predominant. And empty spaces means that there was an issue of representativeness, which means that most of the evidence were concentrated in the lowlands, and the highlands were pretty poor. There was also a problem associated with positive and negative features. So most of the evidence come from so-called positive features of positive evidence. And so from the one hand, we miss some information which affect our record from the quantitative and qualitative point of view, but also we were missing the opportunity to establish stratigraphic relationship between evidence because of, I mean, the isolation of the features. Well, here you see an example of an area that was, I mean, particularly dense of information, but I mean, if we, let's say, switch a bit and we look at the evidence, at the dots, we definitely realize that the empty spaces are strongly predominant, notwithstanding we are talking about an area that was explored very intensively for a very long time and where we found lots of information. Another issue was connected with empty phases, and this was even worse to a certain extent because, I mean, let's say our team was interested to the understanding of the transformation of the landscape across time, of course, but we were particularly focused on the medieval period, so late antiquity, medieval times, and so on. And as you can see, I mean, the medieval evidence were very, very poor. So we are talking about the 2% of the whole sample. So this was definitely a problem. And some phases, what was clear was that some phases were overrepresented to a certain extent, or at least were overrepresented, and some other were underrepresented. So what we were looking for was, let's say, a balance, a better balance to succeed, to better understand, I mean, all the periods, all the different periods. However, what we did, considered, I mean, that, I mean, we focused our attention on empty spaces and empty phases. What we did is that we moved to our, I mean, to review our methodological approach. And it was pretty easy, I mean, to realize that most of the results come from fieldwalking surveys. So the the size of the sample identified by field walking was definitely important, roughly around 70%. So we went through a critical review of field walking survey. I'm not going into the detail, but however, there are some advantages that it works very well in plow zones, for instance, but also some disadvantage. And in particular, one of the main disadvantage, I would say, could be identified in the incapability to identify negative evidence, which is a very broad part of archaeological evidence, and particularly is a very broad part of prehistory, protohistory, and early medieval times, of some periods where negative evidence, perishable materials, and so on are particularly used. So what we did is we focus on a relatively smaller sample than, of course, the whole Tuscany, and we focused on the Ombrone and Orcia landscapes, which are placed in southern Tuscany. And we started implementing new methodologies and new approaches, at least, I mean, from say, the Italian perspective. So we started implementing aerial survey, and aerial survey, I mean, gave us almost immediately a very positive feedback. But what I mean is not just the positive feedback from the point of view of the quantity of evidence that we succeed to identify, but gave us a very interesting feedback according to the questions. So according, for instance, the invisibility of some kind of evidence. And here you see some features and the site, in particular this one, this evidence that is, I mean, of course, I mean, has been excavated, and we realized that this is a medieval mound, this evidence, for instance, was identified in an area that was surveyed for a very long time, but nothing like that was spotted. It is also interesting that before implementing this approach, no medieval mounds were known in the whole Tuscany. So were not known because we were looking using a wrong, let's say, approach or method that were not able, I mean, to identify this kind of evidence. So you can think that, well, we fixed all the problems. We found all, I mean, the answer to our questions, at least from the methodological point of view. But unfortunately, it wasn't like that because of, let's say, the serendipity that is associated to aerial photography, which means that when aerial photography, I mean, when there are the proper condition for aerial photography, the result can be absolutely outstanding, super cost effective, and so on. But if the conditions are not there, it doesn't just work. So, I mean, is I mean, a very interesting and efficient methodology, but unfortunately, it doesn't work at any time and in every condition. So we also implemented another approach that at the beginning was, I mean, geophysical prospection based on evidence that we already collected, as, I mean, most of the people were doing at least 20 years ago. I mean, this approach was good to collect further information on sites that we already identified, but was not, I mean, good enough to answer information that were missing, above all, between sites or between evidence that we already identified. So that's why we moved this approach from surveying sites or known sites to surveying landscapes, to survey unknown landscapes, or, I mean, landscapes that at the time we thought that we know, but many information were missing. And here you can see an example. Here we have this area where you can see some evidence. I mean, this side is a very big Roman villa with different phases. You can recognize some evidence in this area, some other evidence here. And here we have another medieval mound. And what was very interesting, I mean, from our perspective, was that it was possible, I mean, to identify infrastructures in between, which, I mean, there are some evidence that we interpret as road system, field systems, and so on. And this is just a very small piece of landscape. However, then we also introduced another methodology that, I mean, is LiDAR. We started with some tests. I'm talking about, I mean, roughly 20 years ago. And then just a very important point, I mean, to stress is that, I mean, LiDAR, of course, was very useful and interesting from our point of view to get information on woodland archaeology. So on, I mean, to go under canopy and to overcome the vegetation that doesn't allow us to get any information or to implement any other method. And then, well, I also stress on the importance of a geoarchaeological and bioarchaeological approach to get much further information on the understanding of the transformation, let's say, of the geomorphology, so of the soil and the landform, and at the same time, of course, of the vegetation, the cultivation patterns, and so on. So that was, I mean, a long way, I mean, that we started roughly 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And at a certain point, I mean, we succeed to put everything together and to start with a new project, the Emptyscapes project, that started around 2007 and that is still ongoing. Now, well, here you see the two main areas where we work. So one is a rural sample, Rosella and Grosseto, that I'm going to talk about today. And the other one is urban context, that is Veii, very next to Rome. I mean, very important, probably most important Etruscan city, very, very next to Rome. Well, here you see the methodological framework that is, I mean, still developing. But I mean, I already talked about this. Of course, I mean, we use, I mean, all the available sources, the traditional or so-called traditional source of information. Then, as you just see, remote sensing, geophysics, aerial survey, UAV, and so on. And then geoarchaeological, bioarchaeological approach. And what is also very, very important is the implementation of minimalist test excavation, which allow us to collect, as you will see in a while, some very, very interesting information that, of course, I mean, remote sensing or any other approach is not going to provide. Well, here you see a picture of the area. Here there is Rosella. So Rosella is an Etruscan and Roman city. Here there is another big hill with a medieval settlement, Moscona, and here you can see, I mean, pretty far, the medieval and modern city of Grosseto, and here you see the piece of landscape that we studied. Here from another perspective, and two aerial pictures of the two urban contexts. You see what we knew, I mean, the information that has been collected from, I mean, late 70s, early 2000. So the red areas correspond with concentration patterns, I mean, concentration artifact scatters, and so on. And so what is also very important is to understand, I mean, that we choose this area because was not, let's say, a new, I mean, an area that has that did not study it previously. This area has been studied for a very, very long time, applying systematically, let's say, so-called traditional approaches or fieldworking survey and so on. And this was the result. Here you see, I mean, the result, I mean, of course, is just to give you an idea of the result that we achieved through an integrated remote sensing approach. And then you can see some numbers. So, I mean, 22 years exploratory area survey, lots of drone survey, more than 1,000 hectares geophysics, and more than 600 hectares high resolution LiDAR. Now let's focus on this small piece of landscape. Here you see in yellow what we knew before. Then here you see the magnetic map. And from the magnetic map, you can immediately see some linear features associated. In this case, we interpret as a road system. In some other case, as field systems. Here you can recognize a double ditch enclosure and many other features scattered around. Well, here, for instance, we have, I'm not going to talk about this, but here we have some very, very amazing evidence of a funeral landscape and a road system that was useful, I mean, to get into the city, the Etruscan city. However, let's focus on this area. Here you can see the interpretation. So the double ditch enclosure in brown, you see, I mean, the field system. In blue, the paleo riverbeds. In red, some road systems and so on. So we did in 2015 a borehole survey in collaboration with Charlie French of the McDonald Institute. Then we also did field walking based on virtual grid. So we collected, I mean, square by square, we knew exactly, I mean, the position of the evidence of the artifact scatters. And here you see, I mean, the results. As you can see, most of the evidence are closely associated with the double ditch enclosure, and some are just, I mean, scattered around. But what was very interesting for us was that we, as you can see here from, I mean, the dating of the pottery, most of the pottery, I mean, the very large number of evidence are associated with a medieval period and the early medieval period too. So which is very, very uncommon in our area, because and above all is very uncommon when you are very next to a Roman and Etruscan city. So what you would expect to find in a situation like that is lots of Etruscan pottery, a huge amount of black glazed ware, red slip ware too. So the typical pottery that you find next to a very big Etruscan and Roman settlement. But nothing like that happened. And this was really, I mean, curious and unusual. However, let's see what we did next. So we started, I mean, after in 2000, after 10 years, let's say, survey, after 10 years intense remote sensing survey, geophysical prospection, and so on, we started some test excavation. And I would just spend a few words on test excavation. I mean, this is not ground truthing. I mean, ground truthing is, well, I think that probably ground truthing should be, I mean, abolished, I mean, as term and as idea, because, I mean, when you find a feature, when you find an evidence by magnetic or by aerial photography, and then you, I mean, decide to do a test excavation, well, of course, I mean, you are going also, I mean, to compare what you saw from above or what you saw from your magnetic data and what is there. But I mean, thinking in terms of verification is absolutely reductive, because a test excavation may allow us to do much more things. First of all, may allow us to check physical relationship between features, which means extend, let's say, the matrix from the site to the landscape. So which means extend the stratigraphic method from the site to the landscape, which is extremely important. And from the other side, of course, I mean, may allow us to collect lots of information, lots of information that is possible to process through radiocarbon dating, pollen analysis, or whatever. So test excavation means a great opportunity to explore in the detail what you already found. And of course, also, I mean, to verify, to better understand, I mean, the correspondence and the association of a feature with the material, I mean, what is really there from the material point of view. However, let's move. Well, here you see, I mean, the team and the excavator. Here you get some pictures of what we did. We also did a large-scale excavation in one case. However, let's go straight. Here you see the test excavation that we did next to the double ditch enclosure and the road system and the field systems. Now, well, this is the first section that I'm going to show you has been, I mean, is in this position, so is immediately outside the double ditch enclosure, and it was extremely interesting because, I mean, we found well, this is the plow soil, but immediately below the plow soil there is a paleo soil that is, I mean, very consistent, and we did the paleo soil. We were also, I mean, lucky, let's say. We found a very big piece of Chaco that was possible, I mean, to date by radiocarbon. What was also very interesting, that is, I mean, we of course we have a collaboration with geoarchaeologists and geoarchaeologists who help us to read this section, identify in the layer number 3 a big layer of blue clay, and blue clay are I mean the deposit of blue clay is clearly connected with still water, and this was a very interesting very interesting point for us. What is also interesting is that the paleo soil, this is another important point. I mean, there was just medieval or late antique, but mainly medieval pottery. And within this section, we didn't find any Roman or Etruscan pottery and evidence. Well, here you see some other picture. Here we found a very big pole that has been excavated and removed, and of course also date by radiocarbon analysis. Then we did, well, just a while we did in here in the Hero 2000, we did another section and we found exactly the same pattern. So plow soil, paleo soil, medieval paleo soil, blue clays, and some sands and other layers. So it was very interesting, I mean, to get the information from the radiocarbon analysis, which told us that I mean, the Chaco, you see, I mean, this is the dating of the Chaco, which means, I mean, roughly 7th century. But it was even more interesting, the dating of the blue clay. I mean, within the blue clay, we found some small pieces of Chaco that we dated. And as you can see, I mean, is we're talking about the 6th century before the Common Era. So is much more older. Let's going on. Here we have 4000. In the year 4000, we were looking for a road, but we found, let's say, to be fair, just by chance, in the northern part of the road, we found some graves, which were easy to date thanks to the goods that were associated. So this belonged to the Lombard phase, and here you see some evidence of the road. But associated with the road, we also find an embankment. So, and this is the profile of the embankment. Here there was the road. This is the north profile, and this is the south profile of the road. We extended the excavation, and we found a cemetery in the northern part, with, roughly 20 graves, with, also some pretty nice goods. No gold, but, bronze, and no weapons too. And another test excavation that we did was to, find the association, to understand, the relationship between the field system and the road. And it was, very interesting to realize that this is, the ditch of the field system, and this is the road. So the ditch was cutting the road, and when the ditch, was built, the road was gone, was no more used. So summing up, what we found at the end, what we realized that we found is a humid area. So here, the morphology of the area, we have from this side a small hill that is called Mosconcino. From the other side, we have another hill that is Moscona, and just in between, we realized that there was roughly a 35 hectares sweet water basin, which was very, very easy to control, because was very, very easy to build a dam and control the size and the overall situation of the basin. If it was natural or artificial, it is not really a problem. I don't think it's a real issue, because this basin was there for 12th century and was part of the landscape for a very long time, which almost correspond to the time of the Etruscan and the Roman city. So it means that this basin, this water basin, was very, very useful for them. Starting from the 6th century, we have a reorganization of the area. So part of it has been reclaimed. And we know that, because of the radiocarbon dating, but we know that also because we have the cemetery. So in this area, we have the cemetery, which, it wasn't the case, to do a cemetery in wetland or in a wet area. Starting from the 10th, 11th century, we have also the double ditch enclosure and development of the field system. The field system that was built by small channels, and which was definitely useful, to drain the area, which was no more a wet area. Here we have another area that is also interesting, is Brancalete. We are a bit southern. Well, here you can see also, the confrontation between, the first phase of the research based on field walking and the results thanks to the remote sensing approach. Here we go into the detail, and you see also, I mean, here the fill system, the paleo riverbed, and the medieval mound that we tested through, go quickly, through some test excavations. And in this case, I mean, the results of our work, I'm just focusing on some, I mean, on some results, of course, but what I found particularly interesting is this layer that was very, very next. You see, I mean, the shape of this layer that was very, very next to a road system, and that I will come back soon just to talk about this. However, what is very interesting of this soil and this pattern, let's say, of this soil, is that it remember so much. I mean, some sort of region furrow system that is, I mean, very, very common in Central Europe, in the UK, but is pretty uncommon in Italy. However, here you see some other evidence that we collected. Unfortunately, this mound was not that well preserved, the site and the stratification, but it was, I mean, conserved enough, at least, I mean, to find some evidence and date the site. Now let's move to another area, Casoni degli Aiali. As you can see, we are southern and very next to the very big Roman villa. In this case, what we, I mean, explored, and our interest was mainly based on field system and the relationship between field system and paleo riverbeds. And in this case, also in this case, it was possible, I mean, to identify the field system, so the small ditches that we identify through magnetic survey, and also the relationship with the paleo riverbeds. So now, summarizing, here you see a picture with, let's say, the synchronic representation of the archaeological features. And let's say, thanks to the test excavation, I mean, targeted test excavation, the understanding of the relationship between the different features that we identified, and thanks also, I mean, to radiocarbon dating artifacts that has been identified through the excavations and so on. I mean, it was possible, I mean, to transfer to the features, or I mean, to the different features, the dating, and it was possible so to associate different periods to different features. And here you can see a detail of the area that we were just talking about. And so another point that was interesting was the opportunity to rebuild the road system. So we identify some piece of the Roman road system that was, we believe that was just, I mean, going this way, almost straight from the Aiali to Roselle, and moving very, very close and across the, let's say, the dam, or the area where we suppose that it was the dam. And well, this is a reconstruction of, I mean, of the broader road system. But now let's come to, I mean, summing up the overall situation associated with the wetland and the water system. So here you see, I mean, the 35 hectares area that was occupied by the Sweetwater Basin. And so here we have a small river, or a sort of river. And the course of the river here in light blue is, let's say, pretty recent, because this belonged to the 1800 on the 800 cadastre. The blue features are associated with features identified by geophysics and aerial survey, and some of them are associated, above all in this area, are associated with the field system. And so what we think is that this basin was there for several reasons, but among them, probably one of the main reasons was that was there to irrigate the field systems and, let's say, the cultivation systems that were in the lowland. Of course, I mean, wetland means lots of other things is there and can be extremely useful for the animals, can be very, very useful also for because there are fishes and other kind of sources for getting proteins and food, but probably in this case, I find very, very interesting and fascinating, I mean, the position of the wetland in relationship with the field system. What is also interesting is that the wetland has been abandoned and reclaimed starting from the early Middle Age and then during the Middle Age. And during the Middle Age, we found ditches that are there to dry that area, but also the region furrow system, or something that is pretty similar to a region furrow system, which seems to be there because there are some different needs. So maybe there is, well, we know that there was climate change, of course, but probably this is also associated with a period where there are different needs and different problems, let's say, to face. However, going straight to the conclusion, I think that is, from the one hand, it is very clear, I mean, how the remote sensing, let's say, approach and the integrated approach allow us to improve the quality, the quantity, but above all, I would say the quality of our information. I would still stress on how important are targeted excavation to get a proper understanding of the landscape, at least, or to get further information that are extremely important to get the understanding of what is really there. It was possible to spot, I mean, something that was never even supposed. I mean, so the Sweetwater Basin, the transformation also of the road system, the activity during the late antiquity and the medieval time of reclamation, and then many new questions, I mean, are there associated with the social organization, as I was saying, the climate change, and so on. So furthermore, for instance, we identified two medieval mounds in a very, very small piece of landscape, and in the past, I mean, nothing like that was known, and I mean the patterns and let's say the paradigm for the understanding of that period was mainly based on hilltop villages. Well, many other things could be said on this landscape, which is extremely dynamic, and there are so, and I mean, above all, during the Middle Age, there are so many transformation failures, trials, but I mean, the time is running, so I'm going just to close my presentation by saying that about cultural resource management, what we are going, I mean, how can we, let's say, use this kind of results? Well, what we are trying to do is of course, with other colleagues, is to get into the tentative list of the UNESCO landscapes, to present as something really original, let's say, the longue durée of the transformation of this landscape and the association between, let's say, the effort of the different societies in dealing with water management, and generally speaking, agriculture in, I would say, a pretty typical landscape, a typical Mediterranean landscape. Well, this is the website of the Emptyscapes project. Here there are some of the people that allow me to do what I talk you about today. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Campana, for this very interesting presentation about the question of the issue of this empty space. I think it concerns many archaeologists working on cultural landscape, and with this brilliant explanation of how we can achieve to filling with knowledge this empty space, with the amazing work you have achieved in these last decades. Now, Nicolo, would you prefer to leave the question for later?
We have a discussion session also at the end of the
Okay.
day. So if there are questions, just a short one now, but otherwise we can just go on with the program and keep further discussion for the end.
Okay, so if there are small questions online or Anna Leone from Durham University will also speak with Marco Nebbia from UCL about managing and protecting the endangered heritage in the Nafusa mountains in Libya.
Well, thank you, Agnes. So I'm now going to take, can you hear me well? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm now going to take you into a very different situation, perhaps less privileged, where we had to face different problems, partially similar, given by the situation on which the landscape is and the type of the landscape, but also problems related to the long-term neglect of these territory, the impact of the conflict, the difficulty in assessing, reaching these places and documenting the archaeology. So I'm going to present first, give you an overview of what we can say, but also the problem that we have in interpreting this landscape. And then towards the end, I'm going to talk about the way in which we have identified, we are working on identifying the major threats to the preservation of this cultural landscape in the long durée. So following the Libyan revolution in 2011, the capability to retain control of archaeological sites suddenly decreased. I should say, sorry, that Marco Nebbia is not going to be here, but I will introduce his work as well. An international meeting held in Tripoli in 2013 outlined the urgent need of recording archaeological sites in Libya. The essential necessity to develop a geographical information system by the Department of Antiquities of Libya was then seen as a priority to be used for both research and management of sites. Since then, several training courses have been taking place in Tunisia, because we cannot travel to Libya, From 2013 to 2017, funded by Durham University, the Deutsche Archäologische Institut in Rome, the National Geographic, the Society for Libyan Studies, and between 2017 and 2019 by the British Council. So in 2013, the Libyan archaeology staff had already been exposed to several short training courses of GIS, but these had not been effective. When we started, we were convinced that a different approach was necessary. There was no point to teach them very quickly using abstract data and showing them advanced application of the GIS. We wanted them to learn the basic and progressively learn what the functions of the GIS were. And more importantly, we wanted them to work on their own data and understand that every trace in the landscape is important. And the GIS is not only a good tool to make dots on maps, but also an important element to really manage and preserve the landscape and the cultural landscape. A group of Libyan archaeologists employed by the Department of Antiquities of Libya were first trained on field survey technique using GPS, and then they were instructed to survey some parts of the territory of the Jebel Nafusa, collect the pottery and take all the information to then import the data into the GIS. And the next step was then to run a series of training courses that we did in Tunisia. And the courses were attended by the same participants to the fieldwork. So the first problem was, of course, that when they were doing fieldwork, they couldn't access some parts of the territory. So what I'm presenting today is not, of course, the result of my work only, but the work of Marco Nebbia, who did the GIS training course, but also of Ralf Bokman at the Deutsche Archäologische Institut, and Moftah Al-Haddad, and all the Libyan who worked with us. Together, we analyzed and interpreted the data from an historical point of view, but also we investigated hazards and risks that are threatening the sites identified. So first of all, the Jebel Nafusa is a very important region of Libya, ancient Tripolitania, set on the border between Libya and Tunisia. It is characterized by a very complex landscape with mountains and hills, and the calcareous massif of the Jebel Nafusa extends on the Mediterranean side of Libya. The territory goes from the coastal area to the inland hill, and the plains of the Jafara expands into the uplands territory, where the elevation ranges around from 500 meters to the lowest eastern side in the area of Taruna, where the elevation is about 971 meters. The landscape has always been occupied and it offers natural shelter, and the uplands are reasonably fertile and offer the opportunity for the cultivation of fruit, in particular apricots, figs, almonds, olives, but also abundant grain. The region has been key for the trans-Saharan trade, connected with the south, Zuaila and Ghadames, and the very southern regions. And for its location was, however, also very important in connecting with Tunisia, in particular the region of Gabes, that you can see here. And from there, the center and the north of Tunisia. The area has a long term of history of occupation, and it played an important role in the Arab conquest of North Africa and the Islamization. It was the center for the diffusion of the Ibadism, which found its roots exactly in the Jebel Nafusa, the island of Jerba, and the region of Mazali in Algeria. The Ibadis communities are still present nowadays in North Africa, in some areas, and in Oman. The territory is also very peculiar because it's inhabited by the Imazigen that we traditionally used to call Berbers. Now this adjective is not particularly used anymore, and which is a local population of North Africa. Their distribution on the territory is transnational. They are present in small groups in different parts of North Africa, from Egypt to Morocco, and they speak their own language. In the Nafusa, the Amazigh heritage has been particularly under threat from oppression, associated neglect, and subsequent active combat. Any manifestation of the Amazigh tradition and culture was banned by Gaddafi since 1973. People had to move to modern villages and abandon their traditional architecture. Until 1948, the region was inhabited by a community of Jews persecuted during the Italian colonial period, who left numerous now neglected synagogues in the landscape. In 2011, the Nafusa was one of the regions leading the revolution against Gaddafi, center of the conflict, and suffered major destruction to heritage. Well, despite its importance, very little work has been carried out in the region, and the area has never been recorded systematically before. So a survey was carried out in the 70s under the direction of James Allen. And due to their imposing remains, the major focus has been primarily on the mosques, their typology and varied architectural forms and their importance. The focus has been on the region in particular of Nalut that you can see here and Jadu that you can see on this side. The same mosque have also been the subject of a recent work published by Virginie Prévost, and the same area was surveyed before the revolution by a team, Italian team, that has published online a number of paper looking at the geographical setting of the region, the environment and the water supply system, and finally, again, the mosques. Warfali provided the most complete set of information on these mosques and the landscape in his PhD in the late 70s. Now, of course, the major problem of all these existing project already conducted is that the chronology is impossible to define because no excavation and no specific survey targeting the collection of surface material has been carried out. So all the studies were mostly limited to the architectural features or the inscriptions in the mosque, which appeared often to be very late. And many of these mosques have phases of major refurbishment at the end of the 19th century, which make extremely difficult, if not impossible, to identify and study their original setting. Now, the surveyed area that we did in this new project was conducted, covers the territory of the modern city, covered the territory of the modern city of Badarna, Al-Jeosh, Haraba, Kabau, Tandomira, and Cherwes. And the aim of the surveys, apart from collecting the information on the long-term occupation of the territory, was to evaluate the danger for the present sites and support in the long term the creation of a plan to protect ancient settlements from the expansion of the modern city, as we will see in the second part of this talk. The data here presented resulted from a preliminary classification of the pottery and the material collected in the survey that has been carried out by Michel Bonifay for the Roman and late Roman material and Chokri Tohiri for the Islamic period. Now, what do we know about the Roman period? This is one of the earliest, there are some prehistoric evidence, which I'm not going to show today, but the Roman period offers some problems already. Because the evidence of this Roman occupation is very difficult to identify. And the fact that there is not so much visible or dated to the Roman period has pushed the idea that there was not an intensive occupation in the area in the Roman phase. In fact, the analysis shows that a number of sites are dated to the Roman period, but there is no circulation of fine wares, which are normally the elements that we use for dating, while we do have some, the majority of the material is courseware. Another big problem is that the majority of the Roman structures that were built with large blocks were dismantled later on for the blocks to be reused, especially in the medieval period, in the construction of new buildings. So in the survey, effectively, they have only identified one tower that was found that effectively is not a tower, but a mausoleum, whose structural construction and associated pottery indicates a Roman period. This is the number Cabao 29. And offers some similarities with the traditional mausolea recorded by the Libyan Valley surveys that was conducted in the 70s in the territory England of Lepkis Magnum. The tower is located in the interior of the uplands, and its isolation is probably due to the difficulty in surveying the surrounding area, as I said, for the conflict, but also to reach the area for its location on a very high hill and not very many roads to reach the place. And this might also be the reason why the tower has not been dismantled. But the mausoleum indicates certainly the presence of a Roman group of a certain elitarian class in this territory. The architecture is certainly Roman, and it finds some very strict similarities with another similar building that was recorded in the 50s during the period of the British Protectorate of Ghazre Gezira that you can see here. That is another typical feature of another typical building, Roman building. It is arguable that the Roman landscape was a lot more complex and occupied with the structures in the later periods, as we will see numerous mausolea and towers developed, as suggested by David Mattingly, into forts in the later periods, especially England. So looking at the overall Roman presence in the area surveyed, all the sites are located in the uplands, although the definition of the extension of these sites in the Roman period is limited by the quantity of the pottery collected and also by the fact that they couldn't do a systematic survey due to the conflict. And a problem that, of course, we have is that the extensive reuse of building material which has occurred in the region makes it very difficult to reconstruct the landscape. And for instance, when you look at later buildings that are recorded in the landscape, you can clearly see the presence of earlier building technique, and you can see the use of very large blocks as they were normally used in the Roman constructions, but reused in later buildings. So since the vicinity to water sources is a priority, we can see that this occupation of the Roman period dated to the 3rd and 4th century suggests perhaps an intensification of site occupation in the uplands in late antiquity, probably also due to the insecurity of the region that we know very well from the sources. And this is a practice that we identify quite extensively across the landscape of North Africa, as for instance attested by the Catherine survey conducted by Bruce Ichner in the very south of Tunisia, where there is a very clear movement of settlements from the lowland into the uplands starting from the 4th century. Now, if we move later on, the 5th century is very difficult to single out. This is in fact a very common feature in North Africa. Late Roman material continue to circulate. So we can't really say anything about the 5th century, but we can look at the 6th and 7th century, which are better attested. We know, as you can see from this map, that with the Byzantine conquest, the landscape of North Africa became characterized by town walls and forts displayed in the landscape. And here in the Jebel Nafusa, the occupation of the landscape is more intensified, and it continued to be in the uplands. As pointed out by Philip Kenrick, the Jafara and its food is very difficult to cultivate and with little water, while the uplands have a higher rainfall and can be cultivated with olives, dates, and cereals, so everything becomes easier. Now, another issue that we have seen in relation to this interpretation of this landscape is, of course, the impact of Christianization on this region, because we know from the sources, later sources, Al-Bakri in the 11th century informs us that at the moment of the conquest of Tripolitania in 643, the Nafusa was Christian. Ibn Dari indicates that the arrival of the Arabs, the inhabitants of Oea, Tripoli, asked for the help of the Berber tribes in the Nafusa, and Al-Tijani specifically refers of Christians being present in the Nafusa. Once again, despite these, we don't have many evidence of churches, but one can argue, as Ibn Moderan suggested, that these these mausolea anyway suggested that there was a very strict link between the local populations inland and the Romans, and this is visible in the building technique they use in the Roman period. However, we do have some evidence of churches. I have to say that in the case of Tripolitania, very little is known about Christianization, and there is no systematic study. Here are plotted all the evidence of churches inland that we know. But one church is visible in this territory, which is the Church of Al-Azaba, that was found, was excavated in around is located around 20 kilometers of Garian, and was excavated during the Italian colonial period. And very similar is always found in the region as the Church of Breviglieri El Cadra, that was again excavated in 1920 and then again in the 1960s, always by the Italian, which you can see shows very specific and local sculptural tradition. Unfortunately, both churches are not visible anymore as they were left without a long-term plan of maintenance. So we cannot really see the evidence of these churches anymore. But overall, it's very, very difficult to, in fact, reconstruct this landscape, even for the 6th and 7th century, if we want to go beyond the just presence of forts in the landscape. For the Islamic period, when moving at the Arab conquest of the Jebel Nafusa, appears to develop a much more complex system of occupation. So the exact phases of this process of evolution is difficult to single out, mostly due to the limited chronological definition based on the pottery evidence, because after the 7th century, we really struggle to find the specific chronology. But despite our limited understanding, few sites can be referred to the period between the 8th and the 9th century. And the survey indicates the presence of forts with storage facilities in the internal uplands and smaller forts, always with the presence of storage facilities distributed in the uplands towards the plan. The population remained concentrated on the upper part of the territory, and the structural organization of the landscape suggests the presence of a complex network system characterized by villages in proximity of storage facility. And the area instead towards the Gefara was mainly occupied with fortlets, so a different kind of organization between the upper part and the slopes of the region. Clearly, the largest part of the population was, and here I'm showing to you a few examples of these buildings. So clearly, the largest part of the population was concentrating in the uplands, more fertile and easily to occupy and protect. The process of the conquest of the region was very slow and occurred in several phases. And it is well attested by the contemporary sources that the inhabitants of the Jebel Nafusa played a significant role in trying to stop the Arab expansion. And it might be in relation to this moment that all this fortified medieval landscape suddenly takes place. And you can see that the Arab expansion, in fact, passed in many moments through the area of the Nafusa. The structure of the landscape, organized into a system of villages and forts, is attested by contemporary sources who refer to a fort belonging to the tribe of Banu Zamur, while the tribe of Banu Tandimirit had 3 forts. So each kind of tribe living in this region had their own forts. And between the forts, the two tribes was standing the ancient city of Jadu, which was characterized by the presence of a market and a Jewish community. So a very complex landscape that unfortunately we don't seem to be able to figure out very well now. The structure of the landscape emerges quite clearly in the results of this small survey here, where a system of forts appear to have been controlled and related to the presence of the villages. It is between the 10th and the 12th century that the forts appear to reduce in number to give space to larger villages. So we have a further transition. And the phenomenon recorded during the survey is also confirmed by contemporary sources. Al-Bakri refers to the city of Sherwes as the mother of the villages. And here is a a kind of a plotted image of the city of Sherwes, where we have combined the results of our survey with the use of satellite images, a bit what Stefano has shown earlier. And we can see that the main settlement consists of 4 major neighborhoods. The central one hosts a fortified building and several other structures surrounding it on the mount slope, including storing installations. And from the survey data, we know also that in the middle of the site, there is a mosque, and in the east quarter, there is a synagogue. From the satellite images, it was also possible to map traces of a pathway that leads from the settlement to the Wadi Valley bottom up and goes upstream. The written sources say that the Wadi was one of the main routes that linked the upland plateau of the Jebel to the coast in the north, and that the valley bottom was cultivated at the time of the occupation of the settlement in the 10th and 11th century and later. And extraordinarily, you can see we can also map some of the original field system in the landscape when combining survey and satellite images. So the landscape in this moment from the 10th to the 12th century must have been characterized by a massive number of villages like this. And the 11th century authors talk about 300 villages in the landscape that unfortunately we cannot map, as you can see from this map, due to the limited area where we can survey, but also, as we will explain shortly, for other reasons. So some of these villages also offer the presence of these famous mosques that have been extensively studied, and these very peculiar fortified granaries that are very typical of this region, of the region of Tataouine in south of Tunisia. You can find them in Algeria and in Morocco. And the mosques, which are decorated with these stucco symbols that you can see here, which are constantly restored and maintained alive. So I'm now moving to the next part of the analysis. As it happened in many parts of Libya after the revolution, the area is under threat. And here I'm going to show you how, starting from a study of a landscape, we have moved also to try to identify what the threats of this region are. So the first point is that during the survey, they also identified many threats to these settlements. So the first is, for instance, the risk of collapse, graffiti, vandalism, sheltering and fire, as well as conflict. So to this has to be added that the natural impact and the presence of a number of other threats due to the lack of control of the territory in the territory have also had a major are also a major problem for us to interpret the evidence. So the methodology that we used was that, of course, our Libyan colleague, because we cannot travel to Libya, after our training, went on the field, collecting the data, used the GPS to locate them, collected material, took photographs, evaluated the state of preservation, and then we inserted all these field data into the GIS geodatabase with a consistent list of coded values, thus to homogenize the data coming from different survey and kind of eliminating information redundancy and making sure that all these values, for instance, of threats and damage, are well recorded. So the second part of the project was to try to integrate this data with the satellite images. Now, people like us that are working in regions which are inaccessible are more and more tending to use satellite images to try to identify damage and destruction of sites, but also existence and presence of sites. And for instance, this has been done in a very similar region, in a very close region, by David Mettinger and Martin Sterry in the central Fezzan. They did the Saharan region, and they mapped the sites using satellite images. And this works very well when you are dealing with a flat landscape. But for us, relying on enhanced land elevation data set generated from the shuttle radar topography mission with 30-meter resolution, And also with the, we were able to create a number of polygons and identify how the water erosion and the landslides that represent natural hazards to archaeological sites are visible. And we also mapped, kind of created a buffer zone along the cliff line to kind of define the extension of these sites. Secondly, we used Landsat imagery to map the growth of urban center located in the survey area. And you can see, for instance, how the urban center expanded massively. You can see in red the 1972, in yellow 1987, and in 2015, the expansion of these sites that, of course, are putting under threat substantially the landscape and the preservation of this cultural landscape. We were less successful in mapping sites using satellite images. And because as I said, a lot of us are using satellite images as a solution for not being able to go on the field, we can say that in uplands regions, in mountains regions, this system doesn't work because we could only see when we compared the visibility of sites to the results of the field survey, we realized that only the 47% overall of the sites that were recorded during the survey were visible looking at satellite images. This was, of course, due to the quality and type of sites, like graves and small cisterns are very difficult to detect, but also depending on the land use around them and how visible they can be. And more visible were instead, of course, the mosques and these fortified granaries. In the case of Sherwes, it was very successful, and as I showed you earlier, and we were also able to map very clearly the organization of the settlement that is nowadays abandoned. So the resulting map that we obtain represents, in fact, the areas where the overall threat to cultural heritage and to the preservation of the cultural landscape is higher, and therefore can assist it in developing a more targeted site recording strategy. Moreover, the level of risk can be inherited by the points, thus giving an overview on the representativeness of the surveyed sample. The risk level for the different areas has been mostly calculated on the basis of remote sensing mapping, and only the vandalism has been derived from field survey. But the fieldwork has been carried out without the knowledge of the spatial awareness of where the most endangered areas are. And it is clear, in fact, that only a few sites classified as high risk, red here, because of the field survey was not planning according to the risk map, and the majority of areas at high risk level have not been surveyed. So we want now to correct these with the new phase of the project we are going into. Areas like, for instance, the town of Cabao that you can see here, and its surrounding are almost certainly at high risk because of its location, but we have been unable so far to survey this area, and we intend, now the situation is more quiet, and we hope to be able to go again. So one of the major contributions of a GIS-based landscape approach is that it can help prioritizing future fieldwork in areas like the Jebel Nafusa, and in general in the country of Libya, characterized by limited access due to the ongoing conflicts, but also by a very long-term neglect of the heritage and its landscape. So this work is now going to be developed into a new project that is about to start, funded by ALIF, into a further level of analysis, and that it will be developed in collaboration between the Department of Antiquities of Libya, Durham University, and also with Dr. Lisa Moll at University of West England. So given the nature of the landscape, we will combine the field survey with the use of drones and geomorphological analysis, as well as trenches. Since the region has been heavily hit by the conflict, we will apply a new methodology addressing specifically the impact of bullets and bombs on monuments that Lisa Moll has developed in her project, Heritage in the Crossfire. Lisa and I have developed together a new system of combining archaeological documentation, a stratigraphic study of standing structures, the analysis of impact of bullets and the weather in a recent project that we have conducted in the Roman Theatre of Sabrata, funded by Gerd Enkel, and the Roman Theatre was subject to a conflict in 2016. So we now intend to apply this methodology on a larger scale, not limiting it to monuments, but also to the landscape. And of course, investigate more the impact of the climate change and the natural effects on the landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this presentation. I think we have some time for questions.
Yes.
Thanks again, and it's very impressive to see everything you have achieved from the training of the archaeologists and the amazing work the Libyan team has done on the field in such a difficult circumstance. I feel it very optimistic for us. It's amazing to see what can be achieved, even in very complicated circumstance of accessing the field, and nevertheless managing also to have some policy for protecting the site. So again, thank you very much. Are there any questions in the room or online? I'll see.
If there's nobody, I have a question.
Are there any questions in the chat? Please, online, if you have questions, do not hesitate. I can't see anything.
May I do a quick question?
Okay.
Please.
Stefano has also a question, or?
Yeah. Just a question. I mean, I missed some pieces of the presentation, so maybe I'm asking something that, I mean, she already talked about. But did you, or I don't know anything about Libya, to be fair. But however, did you use or did you find any historical aerial photography that can help the understanding of the landscape?
So this is a very good question. I did find them they were taken during the Italian colonial period to make by the Istituto Geografico Militare to create all the maps of Libya. And they are still at the Istituto Geografico Militare, but we were not given access to it. So we can't see.
Oh, really?
They are not classified. So they are just labeled generally as Tripolitania, and we were not given access, so we don't at the moment. But this is something we are going to explore certainly in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, thank you.
I have a question for you though, which is about the earlier occupation of your territory. So I've seen that you have mapped quite well the medieval landscape, but I wonder how difficult is to really make sense of the Etruscan phases, because of course the survey is not helping, the use of satellite images is not helping. So how easily can you kind of reconstruct and confidently reconstruct the Etruscan landscape without excavating trenches?
Well, you know, the Etruscan period is not that difficult to find. There are lots of evidence about all I'm talking about from field walking survey that is possible to identify. And we know pretty well pottery. It's much more, we start having real problem to identify protohistoric and previous periods. It is not that easy. It's possible, but not that easy. From the point of view of the features, through magnetic and through, I mean, aerial survey, to be fair, up to now, I don't have any evidence of field systems, for instance, that I can associate to the Etruscan period. What I mainly found is round barrows, road systems, and yeah, and this kind of evidence. So up to now is a problem. And we hope, I mean, to find a way to better understand. But I would also say that I mean, I was probably a bit too quick in the end of my talk, because I knew that I was a bit late. But however, I think that an interesting approach that we can try to follow is associated with the Sweetwater Basin, because it was there already during the Etruscan time, or almost starting from the early Etruscan period. Which means that was there definitely, I mean, for, let's say, the animals, definitely for, I mean, providing, I mean, easy or proteins that were very next to the city, but was pretty big. So probably was there also, I mean, for irrigating reasons. So what I mean is I mean, the water basin is a clue. So now we need to find the field system of the Etruscan times. But of course, I mean, it's a good question what you asked me.
Thank you.
So for my questions for later.
Do we have any other questions? Well, if not, we can go for a coffee break, and then we'll keep the question for the discussion after. I think Nicolo,
maybe a bit longer.
Nicolo has some question, and I might have some question too, but let's keep us that after having some caffeine. So we will now continue with the two last contributions of this session. And we will give now the floor to Professor Sauro Gelichi from the Università Foscari di Venezia for a contribution in collaboration with also Silvia Cadamuro, Stefano Campana, and also contribution from, I don't have the first name of Granzo and Grosso. So this paper will be about searching for other Venetians, communities at the border of the lagoon during the early Middle Ages. So thank you very much, Mr. Gelichi, for being with us. And I'll give you.
Okay, I can start. Thank you very much for your invitation, and I start my lesson about the other Venetians. I don't know if I can change the slide. I can change the slide from my home.
You can.
Not?
If you just say next, we will change the slide for you.
Ah,
Yes,
it's terrible for you. It's very terrible for you. I'm sorry.
No, no problem. Online assistance.
So, first slide. The other slide. Okay. At the beginning of the 9th century, the Duke Justinian Perticiaco decided to move the seat of ducal power from Metamauco, from one of the small islands on the Rialto archipelago, modern Venice. The second one, please. The other one, please. Okay. Before this episode, but also afterwards for at least 4 centuries, various communities had appeared in the lagoon. These communities were part of the duchy and had expressed their own ruling classes, starting with the bishop. The other one, please. Becoming Venetian was therefore quite a long story. The result was a city that predominated over the rest of these settlements, which within a short time disappeared or were completely refunctionalized at the service of the Serenissimi's economic policies. Torcello, an episcopal seat, is today an almost totally depopulated island. We don't even know exactly where was Metamauco, a ducal seat for a brief period in the 8th century. And Cittanova, also a ducal seat, is known only through archaeological research or aerial photographs. Another important settlement was Equidus, modern Jesolo, located on the northern shore of the lagoon, not too far from Cittanova. Here, until the end of the 19th century, only the imposing remains of the Romanesque cathedral were visible. This settlement was investigated at various times during the last century, but archaeological research has more recently resumed under the direction of the Foscari University of Venice. Here, under the cultivated fields north of the present-day town of Jesolo, archaeologists are trying to bring to light the remains of this settlement and its inhabitants. The aim is to learn more about its history, and through this, to contribute to the history of what we can call the adult Venetian. The other slide, please.
Maybe, apparently now you should be able to control the screen if you want to make a text for the next slide.
I can't control the screen.
No, not yet. Okay, so we'll keep on changing.
I don't know why. The archaeological project on Jesolo began in 2011 and focused on the area north of modern town center, where there are the ruins of 2 important religious buildings. The other slide, please, which had already been investigated during the 12th century, the Cathedral Church and the so-called San Mauro Monastery. The Cathedral of Santa Maria Assunta has been excavated since 1954. The Romanesque building dates back to the 12th century, and the excavations completed in the 90s revealed 2 other structures beneath it. A 7th century church with mosaic flooring and a single apse, all dating back to the 5th century AD. The other slide, please. The so-called San Mauro Monastery, located farther north, about 400 meters from the cathedral, was partially uncovered in 1954. The other one, please. The other slide, thanks. From the preliminary study of the historical cartography and of the traces of the anomalies of the ground, it was clear that this area was characterized by an unstable landscape and the changing course of the waterways. The other one, please. The other, thanks. The first field activity was a campaign of geoarchaeological analysis and the survey. The survey involved 14 square kilometers of land. The slide, please. The other one. The other one, please. And the last one, please. All the data acquired made it possible to define the limits of the ancient settlement. The next slide, please. And to consider the opportunity to investigate an area north of the cathedral. The excavation campaigns carried out between 2013 and 2016, therefore involved an area not too close to the cathedral. The other slide, please. Archaeological excavations investigated the central area of the first settlement and the island on which Aquilus arose. The other slide, please. From the 14th century AD onwards, the settlement was a public mansio located along the waterway that connected Altino to Aquileia. The buildings were made of used bricks and wood. During the 6th and 7th century, the next slide please, the site was completely reorganized and the area occupied by a large, well-organized cemetery in phase with the church with mosaic pavement. The other slide, please. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, the area underwent further reorganization, accommodating storage facilities for surplus, foodstuff, silos, and wooden granaries, a conversion presumably due to the wishes of the Bishop of Aquilus. If the archaeological investigation had, until then, investigated the areas that had remained in ecclesiastical ownership and use from the 6th century until their abandonment in the late Middle Ages, it remained to be recognized where, at the same time, the settlement must have developed. In 2017, research therefore moved in two different directions. On the one hand, excavation began in the area of the so-called San Mauro Monastery with a major archaeobiology project, which we will not discuss in this occasion. The next slide, please. The other slide. And the other direction, one again focus on surveys. The next slide, please. The execution of a systematic and covered core drilling campaign confirmed the hypothesis that the late antique settlement rose on a hump elevated above the surrounding lagoon lowlands. A second phase of expansion of the site was also identified starting from the 6th, 7th century. Changes in the water level due to climatic changes combined with important land reclamation show that the settlement expanded to the south and north of the main core. The next slide, please. In this image, you can see an exemplified graphic representation of the evolution of the island with the late antique core indicated in orange and the spaces probably settled from the early Middle Ages onwards in green. Along with these spaces, the various canals identified are also marked. Moreover, remains of wooden living structure 7th century have also been identified below the walls of the so-called San Mauro Monastery, where, as we have already mentioned, we have been excavating since 2017. The next slide, please. Okay, you can see in this slide the traces of the first settlement in the area of San Mauro Monastery under the structure of the church. The other slide, please. To better understand the overall context characterized in the past by the fluctuation between emerged and underwater environment, the territory covered by the aerial survey is roughly to 200 hectares and includes both the geomorphological relief and the reclaimed land all around. Flights has been planned during late September and early October 2020 and in March 2021, according to the phenologic cycles of the major cultivation, soy and corn. In November 2017, geophysical survey was conducted across two areas at Jesolo, one situated between the monastery of San Mauro and the Cathedral of Santa Maria Assunta, the other near the residential area to the south of the cathedral and its related cemetery. The survey covered a total of 16 hectares through use of the Foerster Ferex 4-sensor Fuchsgate gradiometer. Both investigated areas, extending totally 16 hectares, return high quality measurements relatively free of disturbance or background noise, providing favorable condition for the reading and archaeological interpretation of the collected data. The next slide, please. Analysis of the results has enabled recognition of approximately 300 anomalies within the following macro categories of interpretation: embankment, reclamation area, structure, thermo-remnant, magnetization, contemporary activity, and so on. Also, the mapping process of drone-based aerial photography allows us to identify a large variety of features, including probably reclaimed land, characterized by lower lands and by damp marks also visible in historical aerial photography. The next slide, please. Further irregular 20 meters large traces has been detected, which could be probably linked to paleochannels that crossed the lagoon marsh drained within the land reclamation process. Their dryness is probably due to the sediments that fill the ancient riverbed. Another pattern that we found in this area is characterized by the presence of irregular scheme showing northwest-southeast oriented feature, divided by perpendicular traces that follow the modern field system. This pattern could find a parallel in the ridge and furrow system composed by the drilled part ridge and two lateral low parts furrow, made for a better drainage in the framework on land reclamation in 19th-20th century. The next slide, please. The island area, limited and divided inside by the straight and linear traces of humidity, probably both natural and anthropic paleochannels. You can see these paleochannels marked in blue color. The next slide, please. The other one, please. The first aim was to grasp the system of relationship between the geomorphological structure and the archaeological deposit. Cores were drilled both inside and outside the archaeological site in an attempt to identify the maximum limits of expansion of the reclaimed land. Later, we verified the presence of the canals seen in the aerial photographs, and finally the nature of the morphological heights occupied by the reclaimed land. The other one, please. From the individual core, stratigraphic sections were elaborated, which allow the reconstruction of the cores and the extent of natural and anthropogenic deposits, distinguishing morphological heights, depressions, and the reclaimed areas on which the archaeological stratigraphy was based. The other slide, please. It was possible, the other slide, please. It was possible to distinguish which islands were occupied by the settlement and where open spaces prevailed. The radiocarbon dating of some samples from the cores was fundamental to achieving a chronological scheme of the site's evolution and development. The strategy of choice was based on specific questions, whereby photos, cartography, and related stratigraphic sequences were not sufficient to answer precise questions about chronology. In particular, it was essential to understand the beginning of the activity of the canals, the moment when they began to bury themselves, and the initial phases of anthropic colonization in the different areas of the site. The other slide, please. Finally, by superposing all the data, a north-south section was created that crosses the entire mound and highlights the overall framework of the deposits. In the following, I will attempt to summarize the main settlement phases currently identified, trying to characterize them topographically. The other slide, please. The first settlement phase that is back to late antiquity, when a mansio and the structure pertaining to it were built on top of a sandbank located in the immediate vicinity of a lagoon inlet. This hump of sand in the 4th-5th century was the only part of emerged land in a very extensive lagoon, and above all was strategically located along the trade routes at the entrance to the lagoon. The other slide, please. During the early Middle Ages, 6th-7th century, there was an expansion of the land area due to both natural variation and massive land reclamation by man. Many canals now furrow the area, taking advantage of the natural course of the land. The space related to the initial core of the island is occupied by new religious building, church with mosaics and a large cemetery area. The new use of these spaces lead to the need to colonize new areas for settlement purposes. We therefore see in this period the emergence of a settlement farther north and south of the late antique core. In the north part of the mound, from the 8th century onwards, a parish church was built, flanked by a cemetery area. The other slide, please. During the Middle Ages, a new church, the cathedral, first half of the 12th century, was rebuilt in Aquilus, in stratigraphic continuity with the previous building with mosaic flooring. Data acquired through stratigraphic excavation testify to the presence of structures for storing food surplus in the northern area previously occupied by the cemetery. As we have already mentioned, this is associated with the direct control of the bishop. Written sources testify to the presence of other religious buildings not far from the cathedral, the monastery of St. John the Baptist, immediately to the east, and the two parish churches of St. Thomas towards the eastern edge of the island, and St. Martin in the central area. On the other hand, we have direct evidence of the reconstruction during the 11th century of the three-nave church dedicated to San Mauro, islet in dark brown, which was probably reconverted into a monastic complex during the following century. With regard to the actual settlement that developed during the early Middle Ages, we currently have no data from direct archaeological investigation. Through traces from aerial photographs and the examination of cores, one can assume a habitation use of the island to the east of San Mauro. In the southernmost part of the site, on the other hand, the presence of numerous lineations, also also identified through magnetometry, would lead one to hypothesize an agricultural use. The data acquired through core drilling show that as early as the 10th century AD, there was land maintenance of the waterways, leading to a narrowing of the course of the canals and the progressive silting up of some of them. In this period, we witness a slow downsizing of the settled area, probably linked to the progressive swamping due to the advancement of the mouth of the Piave River that began and led these areas after the years 1000. Undoubtedly, from the 14th century onwards, environmental conditions were no longer favorable to the life of a settlement. The canals were almost completely buried, the episcopate was suppressed, and the settlement disappeared. The next slide, please. A few canals survived for agricultural purposes and artificially rectified, insisting along the most depressed limits of the morphological hump on which the settlement of Aquilos stood until 19th century, as the historical cartography that has come down to use testified. The other slide, please. Further research on this settlement was essentially focused in three directions. The slide, please. The first will be the completion of the investigation at the site of the San Mauro church complex. Here, many interpretative problems remain open. The main one is to give a more precise chronological sequence to the context, including the architectural one, to understand exactly when and how the site was abandoned. Remaining at the San Mauro site, we expect a lot from the archaeobiological project. Here we are in a good position to investigate an excellent sample of the local population between the 8th and 12th centuries. Finally, we expect a great deal from an in-deep investigation of the rest of the Aquilus complex. Through non-destructive or low-destructive analysis, we would like to improve our knowledge of the articulation of the inhabited spaces and the understanding of their internal structure. Naturally, the greatest thought will be directed not only at identifying processes, but also at understanding and explaining them in the context of lagoon settlement during the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. As you can see, the site has extraordinary archaeological potential because it has been undisturbed for centuries and essentially undamaged except by agricultural activities, an opportunity at hand to better understand one of the most important communities that arose and declined in the Venetian lagoon in post-antiquity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gelichi. We have time for questions, if they are online or here, or in the chat, maybe.
I would have a question, Professor Gelichi. You hear me?
Can you hear?
Not good.
Yes, I can hear.
Okay. I just wanted to know if there is evidence of continuity of technological devices for settlements in the lagoon between antiquity and the findings you've made? The way it was transformed and settled, the ipali, the wooden pieces, all these techniques that were used, were they already used by Romans? And is there an evidence of continuity of people living on the lagoon at that time? Or is there a possibility of new people coming in and bringing new techniques?
If I can understood well your question, your question is there is or not a change in techniques of the buildings, for example?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So in late antiquity, you are obviously a continuity of the technique of the ancient and the Roman period, and for the church building, we have the continuity of the technique with brick. Reuse brick, not new, but reuse, but they also use brick and stones. But in the early medieval age, we have the evidence of the new transformation in the techniques of construction of the building, and the new buildings are constructed by wood and only in wood. Also the storage building are in wood. We found, for example, a granary is in wood. We found the silos is in wood, and but this new technology is very sophisticated. It's in wood, but it is very sophisticated. It is very similar to the technique used in the other part of North Italy, of the Po Plain. It is not different. We have the same the typology in plain or in typology of the use of the wood is very, very similar in dimension and in technology with the other structure we found in the Po Plain the same period in 8th, 9th, 10th century and so on. The lagoon area is not different on this. It's not different the other part of the North Italy. So there is no Byzantine traces of construction in this period.
It means it's the same people?
No, I don't understand.
It means it's the same people, it's the people from the Foscari, or?
I can know, this is a good answer, but I haven't know the data to answer your question. But as I said, now we have a big project, a big biological project, because we want to dig a cemetery dating back 8th century, 12th century, and 12th century, and we expect to have a good sample of population of this area in three centuries. We excavated about, if I remember well, until now 150 graves, but there are many other in the same cemetery, and we expect good results about this excavation from the archaeobiological point of view, and we can detect not only the anthropological characterization of this sample, but also other data connected with healthy, with nutritional evidence, and the relationship between the people through the DNA analysis. But they are local. In this period, they are local. No?
Okay.
It's possible some of them come from outside, and we use the isotope analysis to study this problem of the origin of the people coming in Jesolo, in Aquilo, in the early Middle Ages. But this project started the last year.
Okay.
So I show you the results in the future.
Thank you.
I hope, we hope.
Other questions?
Yes, well,
Okay, so I'll just translate.
Hi. So my question was related to the transformation of a landscape in the lagoon and the way the different centers in the lagoon interacted with them. So you showed around the Santa Maria Assunta Church, the developing of fields which are possibly related to the settlement developing around the church. Do you have data for other places in the lagoon where similar phenomenon develop? Is there an effort by some sort of administration or some, I don't know, triggering, let's say, a development throughout the lagoon, or is simply a localized, let's say, bottom-up development?
It's a good question, but unfortunately, we have many settlements in the lagoon area, at the border of the lagoon area, between the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. This is a strange area in the north, but also in Italy, because in this area where we have the many new settlements, many institutional new settlements, because each of one was a bishoprics. Cittanova, Aquilo, Olivolo, Metamauco. There are many bishoprics, many centers of ecclesiastical power, and probably in this center there are also a strong aristocracy lived in the first phases under the direct control of Byzantine, but after they were free to organize their life. So unfortunately, we have many settlements, but Aquilo until now is the first settlement of this type investigated archaeologically in this manner. Because, for example, Cittanova is another settlement very similar, apparently very similar to Aquilo, and not far from Aquilo. But we have on this about this settlement only past archaeological research in the 80s, and with only few trench excavation. But I think this is another important settlement where we can detect the transformation of the settlement during this period, because I think that this settlement were in competition each other, and I think the aristocracy were in competition each other. And another important settlement of this period is Torcello. Torcello was excavated in the 60s of the last century, and new excavation are begun in the 80s and in the 2000s. We expect many information about the excavation of Torcello. But Aquilo, I think it is the unique under the archaeological research in this moment, because we excavated there since 2010 and 11. It's many years, many campaigns of archaeological investigation. It's the better settlement investigated. So the comparisons will be possible in the future when other settlements of this type were investigated. But I think the situation is quite similar. Until the 9th century, there are many settlements. And after the 9th century, the situation historical situation changes because we are the transfer of the site of the power of the duchy in Rio Alto, modern Venice, and then the other settlement disappeared, not immediately, because, for example, Aquilo's disappeared between 12th and 13th century. Torcello declined in 12th to 13th century. But all this settlement declined because Serenissima Venice became very, very strong. And the power of the Venice was very, very strong. But the archaeology in the Leone area is at the beginning, as you can see.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there another question? Then, if not, thank you again very much, Professor Gelichi.
Yep.
Let us turn towards our last contributor of the day that I can see, Michele Nucciotti from the University of Firenze. And also we will turn towards another region of the world with a contribution on cultural landscape on the Silk Roads in Armenia, research and challenges to the valorization.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me and can you see the presentation? I hope so. Yeah,
yes, very well.
you. Well, first of all, I'd like really to thank ULB and the organizer for inviting this presentation that deals with cultural landscapes and research and challenges to valorization that are in a way more related to a historical, archaeological, and historical ideological approach than to an environmental archaeological approach. And at the end of this presentation, I will resume some of the cultural risks for the preservation of landscapes that are related to historical facts and present-day interpretation of the historical past of the area of our project. First, our project started in 2010, and it is an Armenian-Italian archaeological expedition that we are carrying out together with the colleagues of Yerevan State University. This is a very, let's say, crucial aspect, because in order to develop a territorial historical archaeology, we need to have access to, for instance, written sources, epigraphic evidence, bibliography, and as it concerns Armenia, most of these sources are in ancient Armenian, or for more recent bibliography, especially that related to the Soviet Union period, is in Russian. And so the connection with the team of Yerevan State University allowed us in the first place to access this background knowledge that was so instrumental also for our general interpretation. Also, I want to thank the donors and supporters of our expedition. So it started with a funding of EU MP-Ciudad, so a development project of the European Union. And then based on that, we built an agreement, an MOU, and on that agreement, then we received funding from the Italian Foreign Office for starting an international archaeological mission, and that we built on this with Erasmus, and more recently with the ERC Consolidator Grant Armenia Entangled, whose PI is Rui Pogosyan. And in 2021, we also started archaeological investigation and a microstratigraphic assessment of the historical capital of Armenia, Vin Dabil, but I will not go into that project in this presentation because this is related to the cultural landscape of the Silk Road. This is like the location of modern-day Republic of Armenia, which is only like a small remnant of historical Armenia that in different periods would reach also the Mediterranean, for instance, between the 11th and the 13th century with the Cilician kingdoms. And anyway, in most of its ancient history was spent also in what is today the Armenian Plateau, or as it is called more recently, Eastern Anatolia. More in detail, we are working on the area of Bayot Zor, which is in the southern part of modern-day Armenia. Why so? Because in this area we have two branches of the Silk Road interconnecting, and we have a lot of evidence, of built evidence, also written evidence about the Silk Road and about the, let's say, the society in this area, especially in the Middle and late Middle Ages. So as to the Silk Road, what is the Silk Road? What are the Silk Roads? As we all know, the term was first used by a German geographer, von Richthofen, in the second half of the 19th century. And it was thought of as an interconnection east to west terrestrial long-range network between the east and the western part of Eurasia. This is like a linear model that even today it has some, let's say, space, both in valorization, but also in research about the Silk Road, even if, especially from 2014, we owe this to Tim Williams, who is a professor of Silk Road archaeology at UCL London. We have a broader concept, let's say, of the Silk Road, in which the Silk Road doesn't have much to do with silk, and it's not even a road, and it really doesn't have a clear direction east to west, because we can consider the Silk Road an extended network connecting Eurasia. And of course, we have, from our European point of view, we have emphasized this east to west connection, but the Silk Roads worked also south to north, for instance, the spreading of Islam after the 8th century with the Islamization of the Turkic tribe of Central Asia, and also the spread of Buddhism from India to China and then to Tibet, because we first have the spread in China and then to Tibet. Even if in present-day international interest, we also have, for instance, with the People's Republic of China initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, a re-edition of a linear model and of a Silk Road that has a center in China, and from China connects the rest of Eurasia. But this really is not something that is grounded on historical evidence. The other interest relates to the ICOMOS study of Tim Williams, which is by far, I think, more interesting, because it was a preliminary study for setting up a serial UNESCO World Heritage Site, the largest in the world, connecting different evidence related to the Silk Road, and had also the objective of enhancing cultural cooperation among countries that, as we know, too well also from recent events, have a lot of political problems. And so this way of using culture also to have today's nation states of Central and East Asia cooperating, it is a very important present day international interest. Then when we speak of the Silk Road project that we are dealing with, which Silk Road are we speaking of? Because the Silk Road has like a long history, but there are, let's say, global moments, to use Oysten LaBianca's words. So there are periods in which the connection between East and West Eurasia is much stronger than in other periods. The first of this period is the so-called ancient Silk Road, where we have like the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean, the Persian Empire, and then we have the Han Empire in China. Then we have like a second, let's say, important global moment around the 9th and 10th century, when we have in the West Eurasia what Hugh Kennedy calls the Islamic Commonwealth. So like let's say the disintegration, political disintegration of the caliphate, but the emerging of very important political powers and also productive cultures related to the Islamic world. And in the East, we have the transition between the Tang Empire and the Song Empire. The Song Empire is very important because under the Song, especially the Southern Song, there's a lot of development of maritime connections. And so not only, let's say, the land part of the Silk Road, but also the maritime part of the Silk Road is pretty well developed. And then we have 13th and 14th century, when we experience the most important global moment of all history of Eurasia, with the establishment of the Mongolian Empire that connects in a single political unit, despite the let's say, the disruption of this unity in a second period, in the second half of the 13th century, of the bulk, let's say, of the Chinese Empire and the bulk of the Islamic Empire, with the conquest of Iran and, of course, most of Iraq, like Baghdad. This is exactly, especially 13th and 14th century, our focus also in the study of Armenia. So the Silk Road, linear models of the Silk Road are also today, let's say, used for valorization, communication, and development. And we see here, for instance, a map of Black Sea Silk Road corridor that is a joint initiative of USAID and also sponsored by the European Union. Of course, this type of linear model finds, let's say, some sort of evidence. For instance, we see here a 14th century reproduction of Al-Istakhri map of 10th century, where we can see that we have like a topological representation of an area of the Silk Road, specifically that of between Armenia, south of the Caucasus, and west of the Caspian Sea. And as we can see, this map is pretty much similar to the map of the Tube of London or of Paris. Now it is like a linear representation with dots representing cities and connection, etc., etc. But of course, on the ground, the reality is a bit different. So when we arrived in Armenia in 2010, the Silk Road in Armenia was conceived of just a string of caravanserais, basically just, let's say, a string of installation for long-range trade, and nothing else but these caravanserais and some bridges, some, let's say, infrastructures, were considered part of the general theme of the Silk Road. In fact, we wanted to investigate a little deeper and to see how the Silk Road may have impacted in a rural area, because most of the studies about the Silk Road refers to important Eurasia urban emporia. And so we analyzed the area of Vajadzor, let's say, shifting from a linear model to an interaction model in order to explain how the Silk Road landscapes came to exist. In this case, we have like three main, let's say, objects that are the Mongols, Mongolian Empire, long-range connectivity that, as we have seen, had developed much earlier than the Mongol Empire, and then local actors. And we devised a set of intersections that could give and could provide a sort of explanation for elements that we see, we observe, and we study in our project area. So from long-range connectivity and the Mongolian Empire, we have like the planning and the realization of infrastructures for international trade, the string of caravanserais to which I was referring in the first slide before this, that could possibly also have a use in the frame of the YAMS postal service of the Mongol Empire. Then we have an interaction between the Mongols and local actors. These local actors in the area of Vajadzor during the Mongolian Empire are mainly princely families, in particular the Orbelians. They are a very important family of Georgian origin that then Armenized, let's say, at a certain point, and that enters into a strict collaboration with the Mongols. And it's integrated into the Mongolian system of government and into the Mongolian army. Through this connection, the Orbelian can levy some of the taxes locally. And for instance, one of the effects of this collaboration is the investments in aristocratic monasteries and Khachkarization. So it's interesting that the collaboration with the Mongols brings to life in Vajadzor a very dense Christian environment, because the Orbelians are Christian. The monasteries had exemption for the imperial taxes, and so we see the Orbelians investing in family monasteries as a means to safeguard their wealth in case things with the Mongols, I mean, take a very bad course. And so one of the, let's say, effect of the Silk Road is the enhancement of the Christian landscapes in this area. And then we have an interaction between long-range connectivity and local actors in the form of settlement of non-local communities that are present within the larger Mongolian and Ilkhanid imperial space, and that somehow they move and they can create local settlement beside or within Christian princes settlements in Armenia. In this case, we have this really interesting site in Yeregis that is a Jewish cemetery. It's the only one known for the 13th and 14th century in West Asia, and we will go back to it in a while. Okay, what type of theoretical framework we did adopt in order to analyze and to interpret this this context, where we resorted to a few theories like empire theory, great and little tradition theory, archeologia globale, and light archaeology. The last two are, let's say, Italian specialties in a way, while the first two are more global approaches. Empire theory is very relevant because imperial societies are very different from nation-state societies or national kingdom societies of Europe, for instance, because we have like a division of the society in two groups that normally do not mix. We have imperial elites that normally do not count for more than 5% in the Middle Ages, that are armed and that normally are foreigners, and they are of tribal and nomadic origin, and this tribal nomadic population somehow gain control of the ancient imperial spaces during the Middle Ages, like the Arabs did with the Sasanian and the Roman Empire, like the Tang with the help of the Turks did in the same period, for instance, in China. And then we see here how basically this tribal and military elite rule over disarmed, sedentary, and productive and taxed population that count for the almost 95% of the imperial population. And also we can see that from the 7th to the 12th century, for instance, we have several different tribal elites that gain control, in this case, of the Islamic Caliphate. The theory relates to a very old book, in fact, a book written in the 14th century by Ibn Khaldun, the Kitab al-Ibar, and particularly the Muqaddimah, the introduction to the Kitab al-Ibar, that was recently let's say, interpreted and reorganized in a more general theory of empires by Gabriel Martinez-Go. So what is the outcome of this type of division of the imperial society? Well, one of the outcomes is that you can have multicultural societies, because of course the ruled and disarmed, productive, civilized, and sedentary population are free to maintain their traditions in terms just ethnical traditions, but also cultural and also religious tradition, because of course they do not harm the elites of the empire. On the other hand, we have to understand how this type of social organization may relate to what we see on the ground, and in particular as regards Armenia. Okay, I will skip this and go here. So the question is, who are the Armenians in this imperial society? Are they among the disarmed productive, or they are among the armed and military elites? Well, they present a very interesting case in the Eurasian history, because they can shift, and they do shift their position in respect to imperial societies in different periods. So between the 7th and the 9th century, they are like fully embedded into the Arab Caliphate. Then they gain a measure of autonomy at the end of the 9th and until the 11th century, with the kingdom, the Armenian kingdom, for instance, of Ani, the Bagratuni kingdom, that deals between Byzantines and Abbasids. Then in the later period, they first are conquered by the Seljuks, then they free, let's say, from the Seljuks with the help of the Georgians already in the 12th century, and they established their kingdom in Cilicia. And with the Mongols, as I said, they are in a mixed situation. They are, of course, a population that is under the umbrella and under the rule of the Mongols, but they participate locally to the government and also to the military. So in this case, if we want to translate from the material point of view, this position of the Armenians within the Eurasian Empire, especially West Eurasian Empire, in terms of great and little tradition. So great traditions in terms of imperial universalized cultural tradition versus little traditions that are local level resiliency cultural tradition. We can say that the Armenian great tradition, for which I here show one of the most iconic example, like the culture of Khachkar, can be considered a little tradition within the great imperial tradition of the Arab world, in this case, Isfahan, but also of the Seljuks, etc., etc. So this is, let's say, one part of the theory and how we used it. Our fieldwork was based on light archaeology, so a historical archaeology that is non-destructive, territorial, and stratigraphic. Sorry. In order to be stratigraphic, of course, we need to have the possibility of investigating upstanding structures. So we need some upstanding preserved heritage to be used as the centers of our analysis and then interpretation. We are about to publish our first volume on the Vajozor, and I'll show you here some examples of our analysis. So stratigraphic analysis of buildings. In this case, we have the complex of Arates, that is a monastery in the area of Vajozor dating from the 7th, 9th to the 13th century, and stratigraphy of another important church that is at the center of Yeregis. Yeregis can be considered the capital of Vajozor and also of medieval Armenia in the Mongolian period. It cannot be considered a city, but we know that the settlement from the tax registers of the monastery of Tatev may have reached around like 13,000 people at the turn between the 13th and the 14th century. And in this case, we not only analyzed macrophases as we did in Arates, but also microphases in order to model the building yard organization and to map technical knowledge that we can recognize in the area of Vajozor. When doing so, we encountered at local level a more, let's say, a minor and more little tradition than the little tradition of the Armenian tradition when compared to the Mongolian imperial tradition, because we could identify together and with archaeological excavations, we had the dating, contextual and contemporary to the realization on churches like that we see on the left side. We have with ashlar masonries, very well cut and smoothed ashlars, etc., etc. We also have local traditions of non-squared masonries that if we parallel, let's say, with our examples from another project we have in Jordan, seem to relate to a little tradition formed possibly already in the Bronze Age and that continue locally until the Middle Ages. So we have, let's say, three levels of traditions in Biozor. We have the great Mongolian imperial tradition, we have an Armenian tradition that is owned by the aristocrats and is used for marking the territory with relevant architectures that in a way promote and remind locally the ownership of the land related to these aristocrats. And then we have another kind of tradition that is really a non-specialized, non-universalized tradition that is attached to local population, of which we have also a stratification from the Bronze Age, which is TM5A, until TM 8 and 9 that are 13th century. So let's say we have this type of results from our light archaeology. And this is for technology. Now I want to go to the last, let's say, part related to the diagram that I showed. So the interpretation of local settlement of non-local communities within the imperial space. We have, in this case, a very important site that is this one, the Jewish cemetery of Yeregis, that was first studied by the Hebrew University in the early 2000s by Michael Stone for the edition of inscriptions and David Amit as an archaeologist. And it was dated between mid-13th and the 30s of 14th century. And this is a cemetery that is located within Yeregis, so within what was the capital center, central place of Mongolian Armenia during the Ilkhanid and Orbelian rule. So we wanted to understand what relations this community might have had on the technological side with the local community and local producers. And for this, we compared tool marks from Christian architecture of the same epoch of the tombstones. We also compared inscription technologies, and also we compared types of tombstones. In this case, you can see to the right the Jewish cemetery, and to the left the Orbelian cemetery in the same site of Yeregis, and you can see that the tombstones are exactly the same. In fact, using microphotogrammetric models, we could evidence that in the workflow of the production of tombstones, we find, in fact, a workshop, producing workshop that are exactly the same. They are controlled by Christian, and they produce tombstones both for the Jewish population and for the Christian population. Then once these, let's say, blank tombstones are sold to the final users, they personalize it with different writings and also using different tools. In the Orbelian, we find widespread use of bladed chisels for the inscriptions, while in the Jewish cemetery, we find the use of pointed tools. And this is really widespread. But anyway, let's say, so both the communities had used the same artifacts, and then they were personalized. There were not Jewish tombstone makers for the Jewish community, for instance. And then also we wanted to understand what the social status was of these Jewish community. We had some hints already from the inscriptions as analyzed by Michael Stone, because one of the guy, who died and who had this tombstone ready for the Hieregis cemetery, bears an Ilkhanid court title. Apart from this, also, it was noticed that one of the tombstones of the Jewish cemetery had the same decorative pattern of one of the tombs of the Orbelian cemetery. You see, this is the Jewish tomb, and this is the princely tomb. Moreover, this type of pattern is used by the Christian lords Orbelian in the same period. In this case, these are related to structures dating at the beginning, at the start of the 14th century, between 1410 and 1430. And we see this very pattern appear not only on tombstones, but also in the mausoleum, family mausoleum of the Orbelian princes in the Noravank monastery nearby Hieregis, and in one of the caravanserais that was sponsored by Cesare Orbelian in the main axis of the Silk Road nearby Hieregis. Okay, so I go to the conclusion. This is what we understood so far of how the Silk Road contributed to forming cultural landscape in Armenia and Biozor, and what kind, let's say, of nesting between imperial administration and local administration was devised in order to structure and infrastructure the territory. So, with the etched area, we see the branches of the Silk Road. The yellow triangles are caravanserais. Please notice that we have a density of caravanserais in this area that parallels areas beside and nearby great urban centers, for instance, in Syria, like Damascus or Aleppo, as the study of Cinzia Tavernari on caravanserais and caravanserais density around urban center clearly shows. So here we do not have a city, but we have a density that is comparable to the density of caravanserai we find around major cities. Okay, then what do we have? We have Orbelian palaces. Orbelian palaces are found in three sites. First in Areni, or Arpa Areni, but this palace was abandoned. Like in the mid 12th century, the palace of Areni is moved to Hieregis. So it's moved not on the main axis of the Silk Road connections, but on a side valley. And then we have the Palace of Horst that is later and also is of a different type and is built by Cesare Orbelian. Then we have family monasteries, Arates, Zagatskar, and then we would have also Noravank here. What do we see is that basically these Orbelian styled themselves as imperial functionaries along the Silk Road. They acted as sponsors building caravanserais, but also using, for instance, epigraphs in Persian in the more important positions in these caravanserais, and then using inscriptions in Armenian inside these caravanserais. So, for instance, in Selim, we have this important inscription in the name of Ilkhan Abu Said in Persian. That is the only one that you could see from the outside. But if you enter the site, then you find the, let's say, the secondary inscription in Armenia. So they, let's say, they act as functionaries in the Silk Road, but they build their main center, like Yeregis, on a side road where they style themselves as Armenian traditional Christian lords. So in this case, the territory is set in order to provide both functions that we can understand of when we consider how the Armenian dominions are connected politically to the Mongol one. So they are under the umbrella of the Mongol, and this means that locally they act as functionaries in the international connection roads, but they are, and towards like their public discourse to the local population, is directed from an inner Armenian point of view. And in Yeregis, they use only Armenian, for instance, in their inscriptions. And so this is, let's say, a way in which we can understand how Silk Road impacted not only on urban environment, but also on rural environment. And this is my end. So the cultural risks that we see today. What are the cultural risks? The cultural risks are those related to imperial cultural heritage versus national state narratives. So for modern day national states, it's very difficult to appropriate culturally of imperial heritage, because this imperial heritage, for instance, can refer to or can be related to competing national narratives. So in the whole period of the Middle Ages, and then also in the Persian domination, the area of Vayazor was settled by Armenians and Azeris. But after the disruption and the disintegration of Soviet Union and the creation of Azerbaijan and modern day Armenia, population was moved in order to create national state and local national culture. And this provoked in the 90s and early 2000s important risks to the cultural heritage. For instance, in Azerbaijan territories, especially in Nakhchivan, which is an exclave of Azerbaijan to the west of Armenia, we assisted to destruction of huge Christian Armenian sites, like the cemetery of Julfa, counting thousands, hundreds at least, I mean more than 1,000 medieval khachkars that were totally destroyed and used as building stones for modern buildings. Plus the area was transformed into a military polygon, and it was totally, let's say, disintegrated, because modern day Azerbaijan, adopting, as we did at least until the Second World War also in Europe, a nation state point of view, could not appropriate of a Christian Armenian culture that was there because, of course, it formed within an imperial space where a lot of components were present. And so these are my ancillary questions about cultural entanglements that I posed also to the colleagues of the Armenian Academy of Sciences. And there was a lot of debate about that, because this is something that does not relate only to Armenia, but it is a phenomenon that we can observe in all Afro-Eurasian, at least the western part, excluded Europe, of the territory. For instance, Bab al-Futur in Cairo, it's an 11th century building realized by Badr al-Jamali. There was an Armenian converted to Islam that then became like the central figure and political ruler of Egypt. And he wanted the gates of Cairo to be built by Armenian in Armenian style. We, in fact, also stone building. We have several very recent research by Stéphane Pradin about the walls of Cairo. And so the question is, Bab al-Futur, is it an Islamic monument? Of course it is. It is a Fatimid monument? Of course it is. It is Egyptian? Yes, it is also Armenian. And these Jewish tombstones of RECHERCHES are Jewish, yes, but are also Armenian. The Caravanserai in Selim, is it an Armenian building? Yes, of course it is, but it is also an Ilkhanid building. So these entanglements that were born within the Eurasian imperial societies pose today very important cultural issues that translate into risks for cultural heritage that we witness almost every day. We are witnessing them also in after the war between Azeris and Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh last year. So, okay, this was my contribution, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this last presentation, which also raised some questions which are current, actual questions.
Yes, yeah, no, they are really, this is a, okay, let's say we have some phenomena of mapping the cultural spaces in Western Asia and also Central Asia that are pretty similar to the ones that were in use in Europe before Second World War, no? With the mapping, for instance, of the Germanic space during Hitler's rule in Germany, no? Mapping the sites of Germans as a blueprint for a political expansion. These things are long forgotten in Europe, but they're still happening in Asia, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why I so much appreciate the work done by Tim Williams for the ICOMOS studies, trying to envisage a huge serial UNESCO site. And these are issues that like people like us working in also West Asia do face in their work, not just in the studying of the past.
Indeed, thank you. Thank you very much, because I think this brings, again, one huge topic that I think doesn't relate necessarily only on that region specifically, but it's something we are seeing also elsewhere. The contrast between the emergence or the reinforcement of national powers and national identities versus the historical stratification of identities, and you showed perfectly how the cultural landscape in Armenia and your case studies is actually the result of a multiplicity of culture. But in the end, nowadays, especially when we are wanting to present it or to valorize it, it's a real challenge, because you have other forces working against
Well, it clashes with contemporary issues, political issues, and also the use of history in the in present-day political discourse does not help. No. Because in these areas, I'm not speaking only of Armenia, but generally speaking, the use of public discourse, of history in the public discourse, brought like a modern-day selection of the cultural heritage. Whatever does not correspond to the national cultural canons or national historical narrative risks this destruction, and sometimes is destructed, even today, even now.
Yes. Yeah. So I would say we can also open the discussion if there are some other questions regarding the other the other contributions we had today. So this I would say I have already a question for Anna Leone. So related to the destruction, actually, of cultural heritage. So you mentioned that you have several threats to the cultural heritage you're dealing with. So my curiosity was, how can you have? Do you have a possibility of having up-to-date monitoring of a situation on the field? So because you rely mainly, I would say, on satellite or aerial pictures, as far as understood, and then your colleagues on the ground, the Libyans. But is it possible to have some sort of monitoring up to date?
Thank you. The situation is very dramatic in the sense that they never recorded sites. So the problem of Libya is mostly that they have these 5 UNESCO World Heritage sites, and all the attention is on these UNESCO World Heritage sites that have been put on the blacklist or endangered list since the war started. So they are all paying attention to this monument, and they are basically neglecting the rest of the landscape and monuments across Libya. The Jebel Nafusa is a particular case as well, because it's inhabited by a minority, and there are political issues because these minorities, the Imazighen, are independent in Algeria and in Morocco. You might remember in Algeria there was a big revolution of the Berbers, the Kabila, looking for independence, and they obtained it. But in Libya, they have been always oppressed, and they were unable to manifest any aspect of their culture, and a lot of destruction occurred during the Gaddafi regime. So there are political issues, and when we asked to start the project there, the Department of Antiquities was somehow also not very happy in supporting the project, because this was going to kind of feed all this movement of independence and research of power than the local populations have. So it's quite a delicate situation. Unfortunately, we do know that the bulldozing, the illegal quarrying, the looting is continuous. Not very long ago was closed a website that was called Websouk, where you could buy lots of archaeological material. They have recently, the Tunisian police has recovered some ancient Jewish manuscripts that were coming from the Nafusa. So the situation is very difficult, and it's very much out of control, and that's why we really want to go back and collaborate with the local people. A lot of work we have done aside of the archaeology was to also try to increase awareness by the local populations of the importance of their heritage, but this is still very challenging.
other questions for Anna? Yes, of course.
I have a question for Anna. Those very impressive storage building you showed. So what are the dates for this building?
So they are undated, in the sense that, as many of the monuments of the early Islamic period or post-Roman period in North Africa, the date is based on assumption. So on sources talking about these granaries, and they appear from the 8th and the 9th century, but there are no excavations or no specific studies ever done to date them. They are very unique. They are present in the Nafusa. They are present in the south of Tunisia, in the region of Tataouine, and in Morocco. So they are very unique of these communities, of the Berber communities. And the traditional interpretation is that after the Islamic conquest, these populations started to live in villages and have these fortified granaries, which were shared by the community. So they were kind of paying for the control and the safety of these granaries that effectively were probably not just granaries, but used to contain all the goods and the of each individual family. So these are particularly in danger of preservation because the architecture is very fragile, the building technique is very fragile, so they have two faces of irregular stones, and then in the middle they have stones which are basically without mortar. So if they are extremely fragile, and quite a few of them collapse.
And so it's really a collective building. I mean, it's much larger than for the need of a village. It's larger than that.
Yes, they are collective buildings, and they are actually for multi-stories buildings. So you have they are kind of oval in shape, and then you have a ground floor, and each family basically had a room for their own goods, and then there are ladders, and you can reach the second floor. And again, each family had its own room, and then there are 3 stories. So it's quite an extending monuments. And in fact, you are absolutely right that nobody ever considered the fact that they are quite large. So either the communities were very large, or they were serving also people living outside of the villages.
Okay. Thank you. And also, have you any traces of terraces around in the area you surveyed in terms of landscape management?
Well, the only one that we were able to reconstruct is the case of Sherwes that I showed, but the terraces and the irrigation systems were mostly visible using the GIS. They were not visible doing survey. Unfortunately, the area is very difficult to survey because of the hill and the lack of roads, and also a lot has been damaged by the tourism before 2011. So it's quite complicated to reconstruct it. But yes, in the case of Sherwes, we were able to do it, and we intend now that we had the funds and we returned to work. We are going to work on 2 sites, on Tataouine and on the Nafusa comparatively. And we intend now to survey other of these villages which are abandoned, but in recent times.
Thank you.
Other question for Anna? Otherwise, I'll have a question for Stefano, also related to the valorization and protection of. So Stefano, you mentioned at the end of your presentation that the area where you have been working is going to be candidate to the tentative list of UNESCO, if I'm not mistaken. So my question, if I understood correctly, so how would precisely the archaeological data support eventually or offer data to the valorization of the landscape within this application to the UNESCO list, and of course, apart from the chronological information, I would say. So some of the data you've been gathering are also going to support other actions in terms of valorization, or not. So can you just...
You know, this was, I mean, to a certain extent, the problem that I had since I started doing this kind of project. What I mean is, you know, how to find a way to communicate and to, I mean, to the local people, and generally speaking, I mean, to the people, to the citizens, broadly speaking, what we were doing and the huge amount of data that we collected. Then, so the process to I mean, to make part of the tentative list and the UNESCO landscape, this landscape, or I mean, was already ongoing.
Okay.
It happens that talking with a colleague of mine, we realized that what I was doing and the data that I collected so far could be particularly interesting. And particularly interesting because, I mean, nowadays, to get the opportunity, let's say, to be successful with the UNESCO candidature is to be able to demonstrate that, I mean, the landscape or the site or whatever is particularly original. And from this point of view, I mean, having the opportunity to give, I mean, a perspective of very long durée, I mean, in the management of water, and for instance, it is interesting because the water basin probably is telling us that they need to manage water at best because the landscape at a certain point was too dry. The region Faro is telling us probably, I would say, the contrary, so that they often there was too much water and they need to dry the system. So what I mean is a pretty long-term perspective, and that could help, I mean, to give an added value to the candidature from the one end, and from, I mean, my perspective, of course, I mean, having the opportunity to support I mean, the candidature and to make it even more original is probably the best way, I mean, to yeah, to spend these results.
Thank you. Other questions here? Okay, Dario, or I can. Yeah, okay, please conclude. So we have a question from the audience.
Hi, only a few questions. I want to know how the citizens are involved in the project for the UNESCO, for the list of UNESCO.
Oh yeah, well, no, yeah, probably no, well, let's say the citizens are probably not in, I mean, that involved, I would say, but they are the beneficiaries. They will get a very important feedback. What I mean is, let's say, the visibility that the UNESCO landscape is going to have is huge, which means, I mean, the opportunity, let's say, to make better know that piece of landscape and the environment. And from the other hand, I think that another big challenge is, I mean, that when you get in, I mean, you need to preserve the landscape. I mean, there is the risk, I mean, to be, I mean, to be put in the list of the landscape or site under threat. And this is from the one hand also a responsibility which will help them, I would say, to keep their landscape, I mean, in a good shape.
Okay, only the result is it's not the project with the citizen, but only the result could be.
I would say that this, yeah,
Okay.
it's for the citizens, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that if there are no more questions, also for Professor Gelichi, I don't think so. So I think we can close this first really interesting day. I really liked the different experiences. So we have seen different part of the Mediterranean compared. So each one with its own peculiarities, difficulties, and so on. And I really thank all the speakers of today. I hope you'll be able to follow also the next days, because I think the program will present other really interesting case studies. So I think it will be interesting also to compare the different experiences. And so once more, thank you for joining, and see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. So thank you again. And hopefully we'll be able to see in person soon. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.